The man who had walled himself in with silence and stone believed he had nothing left to lose. The woman who fled a debt paid in blood believed she had nothing left to offer. When her fist struck the heart of his fortress, it wasn't just a knock for shelter against the storm. It was the storm itself carrying a secret that could either be his undoing or his salvation. And in the hollow space between one heartbeat and the next, the hermit who had forgotten how to live had to decide if he was willing to die for the family he never wanted. He opened the door. The knock came like a question, without hope, soft, unsure, but insistent. Garrett Boone didn't move at first. He stared at the door, from where he sat by the fire-calloused hand, still on the blade he'd been sharpening the steel now forgotten in his grip. Another knock, then a third fainter, like someone had used the last bit of strength they had to try once more. He stood slowly. A man didn't last long alone in the mountains without learning caution, but there was something about the rhythm of it. Not a threat, not even a demand, just desperation. And in these peaks, especially after snow, desperation didn't come alone. It came with frostbite and silence and final breaths never heard. When he opened the door, the wind didn't scream. It whimpered, and there she stood, a woman drenched to the bone, snow crusted in her lashes and at the corners of her shawl. Behind her were two children, one barely older than 5, the other maybe 10. Thin arms clutched around the younger, shielding her as best he could. The woman didn't speak. Her lips were cracked raw. Her eyes held more than exhaustion. They held apology, shame, and a flicker of something else. Hope, maybe, or the dying remnant of it. Garrett looked at her, then the boy, then the girl. The fire behind him crackled once, as if it too had paused to listen. Finally he spoke, his voice rough, not from anger, but disuse. "You lost." The woman opened her mouth, but no words came. Instead, she shook her head slowly, then nodded. It wasn't a yes or a no. It was both. It was everything. Garrett stepped aside without another word. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. Her knees gave out the moment she crossed the threshold, and he caught her elbow just in time to keep her from hitting the floor. The boy led his sister in behind them, eyes wide, lips pressed tight. Garrett shut the door. He moved without speaking, tossing 2 thick furs toward the hearth. The children sank into them like they'd found heaven. The woman remained kneeling, breathing in shallow gasps, too weak to stand, too proud to ask for help. Garrett brought a chair close and lifted her into it. She didn't weigh more than a sack of flour. He stoked the fire, poured water from the kettle into a tin cup, and handed it to her. Her hands trembled as she took it. The boy's eyes followed every move Garrett made. The girl had curled up in the furs, already drifting to sleep. Finally, Garrett broke the silence. "What's your name?" The woman swallowed before answering. "Martha. Martha Lindley." He nodded. "The kids?" "Thomas," she said, glancing toward the boy. And Sarah Garrett looked at the boy. "How old? 10?" Thomas said quickly. Then, after a moment, "She's 6. Garrett crouched by the fire, poked at the logs. He didn't ask more. Questions could come later. Right now their faces were grey, their clothes stiff with cold. Time was more urgent than curiosity. He tossed another log into the fire rose and disappeared into the back room. When he returned, he had a woolen shirt, an old dress that had belonged to his mother, and dry socks. He handed them over without a word. Martha looked at the garments, then at him. Her lips parted, but he shook his head. "Dry off first. You can talk after." She took the clothes. Garrett gave them privacy, stepping outside into the night where snow still fell in fine needles. He took a breath that seared his lungs and stared at the tree line. He'd built this cabin with his father 40 years ago, buried him 10 years after that. He hadn't seen another soul in nearly 5 years, not one that stayed past supper. And now, a widow and 2 children were drying their feet by his fire. He should have been angry or scared or at least uncertain. But all he felt was tired. Tired of the silence. Tired of pretending he didn't care. Tired of pretending he liked it this way. When he came back inside, the three of them were bundled near the fire. Martha's hair was damp, her cheeks pink now, from warmth instead of wind. Thomas hadn't slept not fully. He watched Garrett like a hawk ready to leap at anything. Sarah snored softly, a tiny hand curled near her mouth. Garrett sat in the chair across from Martha. "What happened?" She was quiet for a long time. "Then my husband died last spring. Fever. Took our mule with him. Tried to stay in the valley through summer. Worked some land, but it turned dry. No one had worked for a woman with 2 kids. Winter came early. Cabin got buried last week. Roof cracked in the middle of the night. We walked. How far since Monday?" Garrett did the math in his head. It was Friday. Martha looked at him with something close to guilt. "I saw smoke. I didn't know what else to do." "You did right." She blinked at that. Garrett stood, pulled out a pot, and ladled what was left of his rabbit stew into bowls. It wasn't much, but it filled the cabin with scent. Thomas's stomach growled so loud it startled the fire. "Eat," Garrett said, handing him a bowl. Thomas hesitated, looking at his mother. "Go on," she said gently. They ate in silence, slow, careful bites, as if afraid it might vanish if they rushed. When the children finished, Martha took their bowls and stacked them neatly on the table. Garrett watched her. "I never had a wife," he said suddenly, voice low, eyes still on the fire. "Figured I wouldn't be good at it. Never met a woman who thought otherwise." Martha looked at him, unsure how to answer. He stood. "There's a bed through there. You take it tonight. I'll sleep in the chair." "I can't. You're not arguing. Not after 5 days in snow?" She didn't. She nodded quietly and woke the children. They disappeared into the back room, the door clicking shut softly behind them. Garrett stared into the fire a while longer. He didn't sleep. Not really. Not even when the cabin went still. He just sat in the chair watching the flames dance, thinking about the knock. How it had stirred something he thought he'd buried. How a woman and 2 kids had stepped out of the storm and into his quiet life. And how somehow it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a beginning. But just as his eyes started to close, there came a sound. Soft, distant, but distinct. Hooves. 1 set, maybe 2. Approaching slow, measured. Garrett stood fast, moving to the window. The moon had broken through the clouds just enough to silver the snow. And in the distance, a figure emerged from the trees on horseback. Then another man didn't ride this far into the mountains unless they were looking for something or someone. He reached for the rifle leaning beside the hearth fingers, brushing the wood like an old friend. He didn't raise it. Not yet. Behind him, the fire cracked again. Garrett Boone had lived long enough in the mountains to know when a sound was harmless and when it was. The hooves did not come fast, did not clatter wildly as if driven by panic. They came steady, patient, each thud sinking into the silence of the snow like a hammer on an anvil. Whoever these men were, they weren't lost travelers stumbling by chance into his woods. They were coming with intent, and intent this far out in the high country usually carried a gun. He held his breath and pressed his palm flat against the log wall beside the window, steadying himself as he peered through the frost-glazed glass. 2 riders, one leaned tall, with his shoulders slouched forward in a way that suggested arrogance rather than fatigue. The other broader, heavy in his saddle, carrying himself with the blunt assurance of a man who believed the world owed him no explanations. Both horses were strong stock, too well fed for a winter this hard. That alone set Garrett on edge. Men whose bellies stayed full when others starved were either lucky thieves or men who thought themselves untouchable. Neither kind belonged near his cabin. Behind him, the fire whispered against the logs. The faint creak of the back room's bed told him Martha had shifted, perhaps restless in her sleep, or perhaps awake, ears straining, as his were waiting to hear if the world outside meant mercy or ruin. He tightened his grip on the rifle, not lifting it yet, not aiming, but holding it across his body like a shield of iron and oak. The riders dismounted slowly, too slowly. Men in need moved fast, but men with power liked to linger, liked to make every second drag so the air filled with the sound of their boots crunching in snow. It was intimidation, plain and simple. Garrett had seen it before years ago when men came to his father's land trying to force him to sell. He remembered how his father's jaw clenched, how he'd stepped onto the porch with his shotgun resting across both arms. Garrett had been a boy then, but he'd never forgotten how silence could be used like a weapon. One of the writers spoke, his voice carried easy through the thin night air, smoothed over with the polish of someone who thought words could buy whatever they couldn't take. "Evening up there," he called, hat tipping forward as though he were just a neighbor come to borrow flour. "Fine little cabin, you got smoke from your chimneys, the only thing between here and the ridge." Garrett didn't answer. He shifted slightly to the side, staying in the shadow, the rifle angled low but ready. He'd learned long ago that sometimes silence was the sharpest reply. Men like that didn't expect silence. They expected compliance, or at least nervous chatter. When neither came, it rattled them. The second man chuckled, though it wasn't the sound of amusement. It was the hollow, empty laugh of someone trying to show the world he didn't mind being ignored. "Reckon he's home," he said. "Smoke don't rise itself." The first man stepped forward, his boots pressed deeper into the snow. "We ain't trouble," he said louder. The draw in his words, tightening, revealing the impatience beneath his practiced ease. Just cold men looking for warmth. Garrett finally moved. Not to the door, not even to the window, where they could see him. He stepped closer to the hearth, to the door leading to the back room, and laid his hand on the latch. The silence of the cabin pressed heavy. He cracked the door just enough to look in. Martha sat upright on the bed, her face pale in the flickering glow, her children curled against her sides. She met Garrett's eyes, and though her lips didn't move, the question in them was plain. "Who are they?" He shook his head once slowly, then pressed a finger to his lips. Her arms tightened around her children, and she nodded. No noise came from them, no whisper, no cry. Only silence, the kind that spoke of practiced fear of people who had learned long ago how to disappear into the shadows of a room when strangers came calling. Garrett closed the door softly and turned back to the front. The men were closer now, their shapes clearer against the pale snow. The first man removed his gloves with deliberate slowness, stuffing them into his coat pocket. "You going to keep us standing out here all night?" He called his tone lilting, but the sharpness beneath it as clear as the edge of a blade. "Ain't neighbourly." Garrett's voice, when he finally used it, was gravel dragged across stone. "Don't recall asking for neighbours." The second man barked out a laugh. "Hear that man's got wit." He stepped closer, too close for comfort now, his heavy boots leaving craters in the fresh snow. "Come on, friend, let's share your fire. Promise we don't bite." Garrett lifted the rifle. Not fully, not leveled at them, but just high enough for the moonlight to glance off its barrel. A silent reminder that the cabin wasn't unguarded. "Fire's mine," he said simply. "Trail's wide enough for you to make your own." That ended the false politeness. The first man's smile faltered, his jaw tightening, though his eyes still shone with the oily glimmer of someone who thought himself clever. "We ain't passing through," he said, voice flattening, now losing its lilt. "We're looking for someone. Maybe you've seen her." Every muscle in Garrett's body stiffened. He didn't have to ask who. He already knew. He thought of Martha's cracked lips, the way she'd held her children close, the guilt in her eyes, as if she'd been chased by more than just hunger and snow. He had suspected it wasn't just poverty that had driven her from her valley cabin. Now the truth stood outside his door, wearing fine coats and smug expressions. "Woman," the man continued. "Young couple of brats with her passed through here. Maybe cabin burned down. They say you seen her." Garrett let the silence hang heavy again. His pulse beat hard against his ribs, but his face didn't move. Didn't betray what he knew. Instead, he leaned his shoulder against the doorframe, the rifle resting casual but steady across his chest. "Ain't seen anyone in weeks," he said, his tone flat, unyielding. The first man studied him, eyes narrowing, a serpent testing the air with its tongue. "That's so. That's so." The two exchanged glances. The second man spat into the snow, the dark stain melting down into white. "Lion, most likely," he muttered. "Smoke don't rise this steady if it ain't feedin' more than one belly." Garrett's jaw clenched, but he didn't flinch. His silence was answer enough. The first man stepped back, raising his hands as though to show peace. "No harm tonight, friend," he said. "But we'll be back. Ain't many places to hide in these mountains. Not when folks got business finding what belongs to them." With that, they mounted their horses again. The beasts snorted, stamping their hooves against the cold. The men turned toward the trees, disappearing slowly into the dark line of pines. Their voices carried faintly for a while, then faded, until only the wind filled the night once more. Garrett stayed at the window long after they'd gone, the rifle still in his grip, though his arms had gone numb. He waited until the snow swallowed their tracks, and the silence felt heavy again, not sharp. Only then did he lower the gun and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He turned to the back room. The door creaked softly as he opened it. Martha sat rigid, her hands still wrapped around her children's shoulders. Her eyes searched his face desperately, silently asking what he hadn't said aloud. "They're gone," Garrett said finally. "For now." She sagged forward, relief and fear mixing until her whole body trembled. Thomas's small hand clenched around hers, his knuckles white. Sarah whimpered in her sleep, turning against her mother's side. Garrett leaned against the doorframe, the rifle still at his side. "They'll be back," he added, grimly. "Next time they'll knock louder." Martha's eyes glistened, but she didn't argue. She already knew. The fire in the hearth burned steady, but the warmth didn't reach far enough. In the quiet cabin where only the crackle of wood and the soft breathing of children lingered, Garrett Boone understood that the storm outside had only been a prelude. The real storm, the kind that came on horseback with questions and cold eyes, was only just beginning. Garrett didn't sleep that night. He sat in the old rocking chair with the rifle across his knees, the fire casting his shadow against the walls in long, flickering strokes. He stared into the flames, the weight of what had just happened pressing against him in ways he hadn't felt in years. Not since the day he buried his father. Not since the day he turned his back on the world and let the mountain become his only companion. In the other room, silence slowly returned. But it was no longer the easy kind, the silence of solitude. It was a silence that trembled beneath every breath, every creak in the walls. A silence held together by fear and the faint hope that morning might offer some kind of peace. When the first pale grey of dawn slipped between the shutters, Garrett stood bones aching from stillness. He set the rifle aside for a moment, poured himself a mug of coffee gone bitter on the fire, and walked to the back room. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, Martha hadn't slept either. She was sitting upright in the bed, Thomas asleep against her shoulder. Sarah curled at her feet like a kitten wrapped in quilts too big for her frame. Martha's eyes met Garrett's as he stepped in. They were tired, rimmed red from holding in too much. "They came for us," she said quietly. He nodded. "They'll come again." Martha looked down at her children. "I don't have anywhere else to go." Garrett didn't reply right away. He stepped into the room, crouched beside the stove, and added a few sticks of kindling to get the heat rising again. When he stood, he met her gaze squarely. "I ain't a lawman," he said. "Ain't got any paper says I can keep you safe, and I've lived too long alone to promise I'm good with folk." Martha didn't blink. "We're not asking for perfect. We're just asking for a place to breathe." Garrett looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "Then you'll stay." The words settled into the room like bricks laid into place. Quiet. Sure. Permanent. Martha didn't thank him. She didn't cry. She just exhaled long and low and laid her hand gently over Thomas's sleeping head. Garrett stepped back into the main room, coffee in hand, mind already working. He'd lived on this mountain long enough to know every trail, every ravine, every place a man might hide or be seen. The cabin wasn't invisible, but it was defensible, tucked behind a steep slope, backed by thick forest. There was the trapdoor beneath the rug that led to the old root cellar, big enough to hide 3 people if needed. And the shed out back, though small, could hold supplies. But it wasn't enough. If those men came back with a third or a fourth, things could turn. He needed to prepare. By mid-morning, the snow had thinned into icy patches of melt, and the sky burned cold and blue overhead. Garrett hauled a pile of wood from the lean-to, checking every corner of the property, his eyes sharp for any sign of return. But the ridge was quiet. Thomas followed him outside shortly after. The boy didn't ask permission, just bundled himself up in 2 large gloves and stepped beside Garrett like he'd always been there. "You ever used an axe?" Garrett asked him. Thomas shook his head. "Well, you're about to learn." He handed the boy a small handled hatchet and showed him how to angle it, how to stand with his feet solid and grip strong. Thomas nodded seriously and mimicked the movements. Too light at first, then too forceful, then slowly settling into something steadier. Garrett watched, correcting when needed, but saying little else. Thomas didn't talk either. He just worked quiet and focused. Garrett admired that. Inside, Martha had found a rhythm of her own. She scrubbed out the stew pot-dusted corners of the cabin that hadn't seen a rag in seasons and stitched a rip in the old curtains hanging by the window, not out of obligation, out of instinct. She was a woman who survived by doing, by moving, by fixing whatever she could reach with her hands. And little Sarah, clung to her mother's skirts until she spotted the row of wooden figures on the shelf above the hearth. Rough carvings of bears, horses, and birds. She pointed silently, and Martha nodded. With careful fingers, Sarah took down the one shaped like a fox and sat in the corner, tracing its edges like it was something sacred. By late afternoon, the cabin had changed. Not in structure, not in scent or light or heat, but in weight. Where once it had felt hollow, like a cave filled only with wind and fire, now it felt full of place with breath and heartbeat. Garrett wasn't used to that. He wasn't sure he liked it, but he didn't push it away. As evening neared, he cleaned his rifle, then opened the old chest beneath his bed. From it, he pulled out 2 revolvers wrapped in oilcloth untouched for years. He checked them carefully, loaded them, and set them on the table. Martha saw the weapons and paused in her sweeping. "They'll come with more next time," he said. She nodded. "They always do." He looked at her, then really looked. Who were they? She was quiet for a long time. "My husband owed men," she said finally. "Not money, land favors. I don't know everything he did, but I know this. When he died, I thought it was over. But men like that, they don't forget what they think belongs to them." Garrett's jaw tightened. "And they think you belong to them." "I think they want Sarah," she said quietly. That chilled him more than the snow outside. "She's not his daughter," she added after a beat. "Not by blood." He hated that. Treated her like a reminder. And now they want to take her. Say she's payment for what he owed. Garrett felt the fire inside him shift, burn hotter. Not rage, not yet, but something close, protective, dangerous. "They come again," he said. "They won't leave the same way." That night, he boarded the windows from the inside. He showed Thomas how to pack powder into cartridges, how to fill the gaps in the logs with moss and cloth to keep wind from slipping through. Martha boiled a broth from dried beans and squirrel meat, feeding them all in quiet order. She didn't ask about tomorrow. Neither did Garrett. They all knew what it might bring. And when night fell heavy and thick, Garrett stayed up again this time, not in fear, in readiness. The next day came with clouded skies and wind sharp enough to cut. Garrett scouted the ridge at dawn, his boots silent in the snow, his rifle slung low across his back. He saw no movement, no sign of hoof prints. Still, he didn't trust the quiet. He returned by mid-morning to find Martha reading aloud from a small book to Sarah, who sat curled in her lap. Thomas had gone to fetch water from the creek, his steps sure now, like he'd always known these woods. Garrett stood at the doorway for a while, watching. It was then that he realized something strange. He didn't want them to leave. That realization hit like a stone in the gut. It wasn't love. Not yet. It wasn't even comfort. It was something simpler. He liked the sound of another voice in the cabin. The feel of small feet running across floorboards. The scent of stew that wasn't made by his own hand. Life, fragile and loud, had returned, and he found himself terrified it might vanish. Later that day, while Martha washed clothes in the basin, she asked, without turning, "Why do you live up here alone?" Garrett didn't answer at first. Then, because everything I ever loved got taken down there. Martha looked up. Her eyes were soft but not pitying. She said nothing, just nodded. He didn't explain more. He didn't need to. That night, as the fire burned low and the children lay asleep, Martha sat across from him, her fingers wrapped around a tin mug of lukewarm tea. "Do you think God's watching?" she asked suddenly. Garrett looked at her. "I mean, do you think he knows," she continued, "what people do? How far they run just to survive?" He thought on it a while, then said softly, "I think he watches the ones that cry when no one else hears. I think he sees the ones who lose everything and still choose to love. I think he's watching you." Martha blinked hard, then smiled, a small, tired thing that didn't reach far, but was real. Garrett didn't smile back, but something in him loosened just enough. But before the fire could die, before the room could surrender to sleep, the dogs outside barked. Not once, not twice, but steady, fierce. Garrett stood instantly, rifle in hand. From the window lanterns, 5 of them moving through the trees. The lanterns swayed like hungry eyes in the dark. 5 of them, maybe 6, carving through the trees in a slow arc, methodical and deliberate. Garrett Boone didn't bother speaking. He stepped back from the window and crossed the cabin in 2 strides, grabbing the second rifle from the rack and tossing it to Martha without hesitation. She caught it, fumbled slightly, but only for a second. Her eyes had already hardened with the same resolve she'd worn when knocking on his door in the snow. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. Thomas stirred from his blanket near the fire, rubbing his eyes with the back of his wrist. "What's that?" Garrett raised a hand. "Quiet now, son." The word caught Thomas. "Son," it wasn't on purpose, but neither of them corrected it. "Get your sister," Garrett whispered. "Wake her slow, quiet as you can. You remember where I showed you the trap door?" Thomas nodded quickly. "Take her down there. Stay quiet. Don't come up unless I say." Thomas darted to the back room, his small hands already shaking Martha's shoulder. She pulled Sarah into her arms. The little girl, groggy, but not crying. That child had learned silence the hard way. Martha looked at Garrett. "Do you think they'll talk this time?" "No," he said plainly. "Men don't carry 6 lanterns just to negotiate." They moved with a quiet discipline, born not of training, but desperation. Garrett pulled the rug aside, opened the cellar door beneath the table, and motioned to Thomas and Sarah. The boy helped his sister down first, then climbed after her. Martha followed last, squeezing Garrett's hand before descending. "You'll let me know?" she asked quietly. "I will," he said. The trapdoor shut behind her. Garrett pulled the rug back over it, tossed a fur on top, then moved to the window again. The lanterns were closer now. 2 had broken off and circled wide, flanking the cabin. He heard the creak of saddles, the muted shuffle of hooves. They were surrounding him. He turned off the fire's edge with a poker, casting most of the room into shadow. Then he waited in silence. Breath held every heartbeat pounding in his ears like a drum. Outside, boots hit the snow. Low voices, laughter, but not the kind that came from joy. The kind that came before something was about to be broken. Then came the knock. Not like Martha's. This one was bold, a fist solid 3 times. Garrett didn't move. Another knock. Then a voice too loud, too smooth. It was the first man again, the one who'd called out the night before. "Friend, I think we got off on the wrong foot. See, there's something inside your home that don't belong to you. A woman, 2 children." Garrett stayed still. The man chuckled. "I don't want to come in there. Truth be told, my boots are soaked and I hate muddying up a nice floor. So how about you send him out nice and polite? We'll be on our way. No blood, no mess. Garrett slowly stepped toward the door, rifle raised. The man kept talking. She didn't tell you, huh? About the claim about the debt her man left behind. It's fair business, sir. Nothing crooked, just what's owed. Garrett reached the door, took a deep breath, then cracked it open just wide enough to be heard. You're not talking anyone. The man grinned at the crack of the door, even in shadow. That's so. Garrett didn't answer. The man's voice sharpened. She's a liar. She stole from us. Left with something that was bought fair. A child. The man tilted his head. She's not hers. Not really. Her husband owed plenty, and we made a deal. That girl was part of it. A life for a life. Garrett felt something inside him burn. You're not talking her. The man sighed like he was disappointed, then stepped back. Well then, I guess we'll come get her ourselves. He turned, whistled. Gunfire cracked from the tree line. Aimless warning shots into the air meant to scare. Garrett didn't flinch. He raised the rifle through the doorway and fired once. The man dove. The bullet missed his head by inches and shattered a lantern behind him, plunging half the clearing into sudden darkness. The horses reared. Someone cursed, then chaos. Garrett slammed the door shut just as another bullet hit it. He bolted it, threw his shoulder into the side wall, ducking low as more shots came from the trees. Glass exploded from a side window. Wood splintered near his ear. He crawled toward the hearth, dragging the second rifle with him. He fired again, blind through the broken window, heard someone scream, then silence. They weren't expecting resistance. They thought him a hermit with no fire left in him. They were wrong. Outside, he heard scrambling yelling. Orders barked. They weren't retreating. They were regrouping. Garrett used the lull to grab the second revolver from the table and crawled to the back room. He lifted the trapdoor gently and peeked inside. Martha's face was pale in the faint light. You all right? He whispered. She nodded. One of them got hit, heard him scream. He passed her one of the revolvers. If they breach the walls, shoot anything that moves. Don't wait. Don't hesitate. She swallowed hard. Garrett. But he was already closing the trap again. Back in the main room, Garrett ducked behind the upturned table, heart hammering. The front door wouldn't last. The window was already shattered. He could see shadows moving beyond the trees' figures, circling, planning. He'd hunted wolves in these woods before. This felt no different. The next attack came hard and fast. They rushed from three sides, boots crunching, guns drawn, shouting. One made it to the porch and tried the door. When it didn't give, he smashed the butt of his rifle through the window and tried to climb in. Garrett shot him in the shoulder. The man howled and fell back, landing in the snow with a curse. Another man took a shot at the roof, trying to draw Garrett's fire. Garrett ignored him and focused on the one circling around the back. He moved fast, pressing his body against the wall, peering through a crack just in time to see the glint of a blade. Garrett fired once. The man dropped without a sound. 3 down, more to go. Inside the trap door, Martha held Sarah close to the revolver, shaking in her hand. Thomas clutched her arm. He's going to win, Mama, he whispered. Mr. Boone's strong. Martha didn't answer. She didn't trust hope. Not yet. Back in the cabin, smoke filled the room from the repeated gunshots and the dying fire. Garrett coughed, eyes watering, but didn't stop. He checked his last rounds. 4 bullets left. 1 knife. He crouched by the door, heart pounding. Then everything went quiet. Too quiet. No more boots. No more shouting. Just snowflakes dancing in the smoke and silence. Garrett waited. Listened. Then a voice, not the smooth one, a new one, deeper, older. Garrett Boone, it called. That stopped him cold. He stood slowly, rifle still in hand. Who's asking a pause then? Name's Malcolm Carney. Your father knew me. I used to ride with him back before the war. Garrett stepped to the door, cracked at an inch. The face outside was older, lined by time and mountain cold. A heavy coat grey beard rifle lowered. I ain't here to kill you, Malcolm said. I didn't know who you were till one of my boys said your name. You're leading them. I'm controlling them, Malcolm said grimly. Barely. Garrett opened the door wider. He saw 3 of the remaining men tending to the wounded. One had his arm tied off with a bandana. Another was holding a bloody shoulder. We done here? Garrett asked. Malcolm nodded slowly. I didn't sign up to take kids from women. That wasn't part of the job. But you just shot 3 of mine, so I can't exactly walk away without a decision. Garrett didn't move. You give me your word, she stays put, I won't come back, Malcolm said. But if she runs again, others will follow. Men worse than me. Men who don't care who she is or who gets in the way. Garrett's voice was low. She's not running anymore. Malcolm studied him. You sure about that? Garrett nodded. Malcolm gave one final look around, then turned to his men. Mount up, we're leaving. One of them protested, but Malcolm turned eyes cold. You want to stay behind fine? I'll bury you myself. The others shut up. They mounted their horses. Malcolm looked at Garrett one last time. You're your father's son, all right, he said. And then they rode. Garrett watched until they disappeared into the tree line. Only when the forest swallowed them whole did he lower the rifle. He turned back to the cabin boots, crunching slowly through the red-streaked snow. When he lifted the trapdoor again, Martha was crying, not in fear, in relief. He helped her out, then Sarah and Thomas. The boy immediately wrapped his arms around Garrett's waist, pressing his face against his coat. Garrett stood still, surprised by the gesture, unsure how to return it, but he did slowly, one hand, resting awkwardly on the boy's back. Martha looked at him, tears still in her eyes. You didn't have to do that, she whispered. Garrett met her gaze steady. You knocked, he said. That was enough. Garrett Boone didn't speak much for the rest of that day. After the last echo of hooves vanished into the forest, he moved like a man with a storm still in his chest, measured alert, not trusting that peace could last. He dragged the 2 wounded men off the porch and into the woods, where he tied them to a tree trunk with just enough slack to let them breathe. One groaned through bloodied teeth. Garrett checked his pulse, but not out of kindness. He just wanted to know how long before the wolves found them, or if Malcolm would return for them in the night. He left them with a canteen and a knife within reach, but barely. Mercy maybe, but not forgiveness. Back at the cabin, Martha cleaned glass from the window frame with quiet hands. She didn't ask where Garrett had gone. She didn't ask what he'd done. She simply swept and wiped and picked shards from between the floorboards, while Sarah sat nearby playing with the wooden fox again, running her fingers over the smooth edges as though it could protect her. Thomas tried to carry in more firewood, his arm still trembling from the night's fear, but he didn't stop working. Garrett returned without a word and secured the broken window with a sheet of scrap wood and nails from the shed. Each hammer strike echoed through the cabin like a heartbeat. They ate in silence that night, dried jerky flatbread, and whatever was left of the broth. The air still carried the scent of gunpowder, and no one lit the lanterns brighter than a flicker. They desurvived, but surviving was not the same as living. After Sarah fell asleep, curled in her mother's lap, Thomas stood by the hearth with his arms crossed. Are they going to come back? He asked, voice thin but steady. Garrett looked up from his chair. He didn't offer false comfort. He didn't lie. Not them, he said, but maybe others. Thomas nodded once. He didn't cry, didn't tremble, just sat beside his sister and picked up the wooden fox she'd left behind. I'll be ready, he said. Garrett watched him, and for the first time since the war, felt something swell in his chest. Not pride exactly, something quieter, something more dangerous, a sense of belonging. Later that night, after the fire had dwindled and the wind began its slow whimper through the trees, Martha sat across from Garrett again. Her hands were wrapped around a warm mug, though the tea inside had long gone cold. You didn't have to protect us, she said. Garrett stared at the embers. Didn't feel right not to. Martha leaned forward slightly. Most men wouldn't have cared. He met her eyes then, and the fire's last glow flickered between them. Most men don't live alone this long, unless they've got things they regret. She said nothing, just let the words sit there. Garrett finally sighed, leaning back in the chair until it creaked under his weight. "You want the truth?" he said quietly. Martha nodded. "My father built this cabin with his bare hands. Raised me here. My mother died before I was old enough to remember her. He kept this place alive. Taught me to trap, to hunt, to fix a broken axle in a snowstorm. I left when I was 20 to see the world fight in the war. Thought maybe I'd come back a hero. Maybe even bring someone back with me." He looked down at the rifle resting near his boot. "I brought back a bullet in my leg and the ghost of a friend who didn't make it. After that, I couldn't stomach people, their noise, their questions, their demands. I told myself I was better off up here, and I believed it until I heard that knock." Martha's eyes softened. "I never had a wife," Garrett added. "Never thought I needed one, but now I wonder if I just didn't know what I was missing." Martha smiled, then not wide, not bright, but warm real. "You didn't know what you were missing because you were surviving," she said. "That's what I've been doing too, just surviving." He nodded slowly. Outside, the wind kicked harder and the shutters rattled once. "I want to stay," Martha said suddenly, her voice stronger than it had been since arriving. "If that's all right, I want to work. Help you with the land. I won't be a burden, and the children, they'll pull their weight. I can't go back to a world that would have let men like that take Sarah." Garrett didn't answer right away. He reached over, stirred the coals with the iron poker, and watched them flare orange. "You stay," he said. "This place, these mountains, they're mean. They're cold, but they protect what matters. If you're willing to stay, then I'll make sure no one ever comes for her again." Martha blinked fast, her hand rising to cover her mouth. She nodded, unable to speak. Garrett stood and moved toward the back room. As he passed her, he paused. "We'll need to build more space," he said. "This cabin wasn't meant for a family." She laughed softly, and it echoed sweet through the cabin. The next morning, the first thing Garrett did was bring out the old woodcutting tools. Thomas joined him after breakfast, still small but eager, and Garrett began teaching him how to measure plank length, how to strip bark from a beam, how to sharpen the edge of a saw with a flint stone. By noon, they'd cleared the plot behind the cabin just beyond the lintel. Martha had started mapping the kitchen garden she'd always wanted. Sarah spent the morning stacking stones around the fire pit, like she was building a castle. The old silence was gone now, replaced by a new kind, gentle, filled with the sound of chores and conversation. Garrett hadn't realized until then how much he missed the sound of someone humming while they worked. At supper, he brought out the last of the smoked venison. Martha made cornbread from what little flour they had, and even added a pinch of dried herbs she'd found in a jar above the hearth. "This is the best I've eaten in years," Garrett said, not looking up. Martha gave him a sly smile. "That's only because you've been boiling meat and chewing pine bark." Thomas laughed around a mouthful of bread, and even Sarah giggled. Garrett smiled. That night, he carved another figure for the shelf above the hearth. Not a bear or a fox this time. A woman, slim and graceful, holding 2 children at her side. He placed it between the others without a word. Martha saw it. She didn't say anything, but later, when she thought he'd gone to sleep, she touched the carving's shoulder with her fingertips and stood staring at it long into the night. Weeks passed. Snow melted slowly into soft mud and icy runoff. Spring crept into the valley, first in green shoots at the edge of the trees, then in birdsong echoing down from the high ridges. Garrett and Thomas finished the extension on the cabin, a small second room with space enough for 2 cots and a wooden chest for clothes. Garrett built it by hand, but let Thomas place the final nail in the frame. "That's yours now," Garrett said, clapping him on the back. "You ever want to change it? You got to fix it yourself." Thomas beamed. Sarah planted wildflowers in an old tin basin near the steps. She named each one. "This is hope," she said, "of the yellow bloom. And this one's courage. This one's Mama's heart." Martha knelt beside her and hugged her tight. They were becoming something. Not just a household, not just survivors, something deeper. Family. But peace in the mountains was always borrowed, never owned. And it came due again one morning when Garrett returned from checking the traps and found smoke rising not from the hearth, but from beyond the ridge, a different smoke, black angry. Too thick for cooking, too tall for a campfire. He knelt, pressed his hand to the earth. Vibrations distant but clear. Horses, many of them. He turned back toward the cabin, heart sinking. Whatever safety they'd built, it was about to be tested all over again. The smoke didn't lie. It rose from beyond the far ridge in a thick black coil, too wide to be from a single fire. It was the kind of smoke Garrett had seen only a few times in his life. The kind that came when men didn't just pass through, but came with purpose, with numbers, and with a reason to burn. It threaded the sky like a warning, twisting through the branches and blotting the blue above with a bitter promise. He didn't run back to the cabin. Garrett Boone never ran, but his pace was swift, and silent boots crunching through the last of the snow melt every step placed with intention. When the cabin came into view, his eyes swept the clearing. Martha was hanging clothes on the line, strung between two trees, her sleeves rolled high, arms pale in the early spring sun. Thomas was stacking kindling near the porch, and Sarah sat on the steps, humming as she tied knots in a length of string. Garrett reached the porch and spoke low. "Inside now." Martha turned startled. One look at his face told her all she needed. She dropped the shirt she'd been pinning and rushed to gather the children. Garrett stepped to the edge of the yard, eyes fixed on the horizon, the wind carrying the first whiff of burning pine. Inside the cabin fell into practiced motion. The children were quiet, alert. Martha closed the shutters and pulled the rifle from beneath the bed. Garrett joined her, grabbing the revolvers, loading shells, setting everything where it belonged. "How many?" she asked. "Too many," Garrett replied. "Same men." "Don't know, but they're not just passing by." Martha sat hard on the edge of the bed. "We just started to feel safe." Garrett looked at her, his face unreadable. "Then we fight to keep it." He stepped outside again, walking the perimeter, checking the traps he'd laid weeks ago. Trip lines, bells, spikes hidden beneath brush. They were simple, but they'd buy him time. He'd seen what a few clever barriers could do against a crowd. Delay was often the best advantage a man could ask for. But he needed more than traps. He needed information. He saddled his horse quickly, the animal restless beneath him. Thomas stepped out onto the porch jaw set. "You go in toward the smoke." Garrett nodded. "I want to help," the boy said. "You are helping," Garrett replied. "By staying and protecting your mama and sister." Thomas looked like he wanted to argue but didn't. Instead, he stepped forward and handed Garrett a small carving from his pocket, an eagle wings outspread. "I made it for you." Garrett took it, held it for a second longer than he meant to. "Thank you, son." Son, there it was again. Garrett didn't correct himself this time. He rode hard, keeping low along the ridge, using the tree line for cover. The closer he got to the smoke, the more certain he became. This wasn't an accident. There were at least 10 men, maybe more, gathered near a flat patch of earth just beyond the old trail that led toward the mining valley. Horses tied wagons nearby, and the kind of camp setup that said they weren't planning to leave soon. He spotted something else too. A banner tied to a post fluttering in the wind. Black, with a red circle in the center, not a gang emblem, something more official. And then he saw the uniforms. Government men, not marshals. Private enforcers hired by land barons who wanted to settle mountain territory for timber or rail. Men with papers in their pockets that said they had the right to dig up what they pleased, displace who they wanted. It was legal theft dressed in velvet words. Garrett had seen it before back in the valleys, where whole families were turned out of their homes because of a misfiled deed or a forgotten tax. He circled back quietly, unseen, and returned to the cabin just before dusk. "They're not bounty hunters," he told Martha. "They're worse. They've got law behind them, or at least the kind they paid for. They're clearing land, pushing folks out. But we're miles from the valley," she said. "They're expanding." Garrett said the fire. They burned out a homestead today. I saw the ruins. Barn still smoldering. Martha polled. People didn't see any. Either gone or buried under the ash. She didn't ask for more. Garrett knelt beside the hearth, pulled the carving Thomas had given him from his pocket, and set it gently on the mantel. "They're coming. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not even this week, but they'll come." Martha sat beside him. "We could leave." "No," he said firmly. "This is your home now, ours." He didn't mean to say it that way, but he did. And Martha heard it. She didn't answer with words, just rested her hand on his arm, steady and warm. That night, Garrick couldn't sleep. He stood outside the cabin beneath the stars, the cold wind threading through his hair. The trees rustled like whispers, and the mountains loomed like ancient sentinels. He felt small for the first time in years, but not powerless. Martha joined him quietly, a shawl around her shoulders. "Did I ever tell you about my first spring alone?" she asked. Garrett shook his head. "I buried my husband in winter. Tried to plant potatoes come thaw, but the ground was still too hard. I knelt there for hours, trying to break it, crying so hard I thought my lungs would break. Then Sarah came toddling out with her little hands full of flower seeds. I asked her what she thought she was doing. She said, 'Going to help you grow the sunshine, Mama.'" Garrett smiled faintly. Martha looked out over the valley. "I didn't think I could keep going, but something about her face, it reminded me, God doesn't leave us even when we feel abandoned. Maybe he just waits to show us the next place we're needed." Garrett was quiet for a long time, then said, "You believe he sent you here?" "I do now." He nodded. Not because he fully believed, but because he wanted to. By the following morning, Garrett had a plan. He wouldn't wait for the camp to march closer. He'd go to them, but not alone. There was one man he hadn't seen in years who might still have pull. An old friend from the war who'd settled further north near the river fork. Jacob Monroe, a man who traded his rifle for law, became a circuit judge and had enough spine to stand up to these types. It would take a full day's ride. Garrett packed light, took his horse a rifle, a sidearm, and a letter written in Martha's hand, her story in her words. He left the cabin before sunup, trusting the land to hold, until he returned. Martha took charge like she'd been born to do it. She taught Thomas to boil water for tea, showed Sarah how to stitch a rip in her coat, and swept the floors so clean they shined in the low light. But that night, they heard the first scout. A horse light and fast circling just beyond the trees. Martha blew out the lantern and gathered the children. They huddled in the cellar again, this time without Garrett. Sarah whimpered softly. "Where is Papa?" The word stunned Martha. For a moment she couldn't breathe. Thomas answered for her. "He'll come back." Martha kissed them both and wrapped her arms around them tight. Above them, footsteps circled the cabin, a knock, then silence. They didn't answer. The scout left eventually, but they all knew it was only a beginning. Garrett rode hard, every bone in his body sore from the pace, but he didn't stop. He reached Jacob Monroe's homestead just after dusk the next day, covered in dust and grim with urgency. Jacob took one look at him and opened the door wide. "Lord Garrett thought you were dead." "Not yet," Garrett said, "but I might be soon." He handed over Martha's letter, explained everything in short clipped words. Jacob read it, brow furrowed. "That's half the valley's story these days," Jacob said. "They're buying up land, pushing out settlers, forcing women and children off their claims. Can you help?" Jacob stood. "I can do more than help. I can bring the law, real law. It'll take a few days, but I can ride with a warrant and a marshal. If they're still there when I arrive, they'll wish they never climbed those mountains." Garrett nodded. "I'll hold the line until then." Jacob put a hand on his shoulder. "Be careful." "I've got people now," Garrett said quietly. "I won't let them be taken." He rode back in the dark, the stars watching like old friends. He didn't sleep, didn't rest. He just rode toward the cabin, toward danger, toward home. The trail home felt longer than it had days ago. Garrett Boone rode through the thick of night with muscles stiff and his mind spinning faster than his horse could carry him. He leaned forward, whispering soft to the mare, as the stars wheeled overhead, urging the animal past exhaustion. There was no time to waste. not with the smoke still fresh in his memory, and Martha's face burned into the front of his thoughts. When he finally crested the hill overlooking his land, he pulled the reins hard and stared. The cabin was still there, whole quiet, but a lantern flickered low in the barn, a place where no lantern should have been burning at that hour. Garrett narrowed his eyes, scanning the trees. No fresh tracks from his vantage, but the stillness felt wrong. The air didn't move. The dogs weren't barking. He dismounted quietly and tied the mare just inside the tree line. Then he crouched, low rifle slung across his back, and moved down the hill like a shadow. Years of mountain living had sharpened every sense. He could smell the oil from that lantern, could feel the tension waiting beneath the soil. His bootsteps made no sound. He reached the barn first, crouching beneath the lowest beam, peering inside. Empty, just the cow dozing in the straw, and the lantern lit, but untended a distraction. He turned toward the cabin, heart thutooing now, not from fear but fury. They were inside. He slipped along the side of the porch, crept beneath the window, and listened. A voice drifted through the wood. Male confident, too casual for someone uninvited. Not asking twice. "Sweetheart, we know you've got something here don't belong to you." Another voice, Martha's, calm but cold. "You're wrong. There's nothing here for you. Then why is your hand shaken?" Garrett felt it then. That old fire. The one he thought he'd buried in the war. The one that came roaring back any time something precious was threatened. He moved around the back, found the hatch to the root cellar cracked just slightly. It hadn't been latched from inside. That wasn't an accident. Martha had left it that way for him. He opened it, slow, silent, and dropped down into the dark. It was tight, the air stale, but he could hear them above heavy boots across the floor. Then a small scuffle, something knocked over, a muffled cry. Sarah. He moved to the ladder and eased it open. His hand reached for the revolver at his hip. Then he sprang. The cabin's back room lit up in motion as Garrett came up through the floor with a crack of gunmetal and fury. One man had Martha pinned near the hearth. Another had Sarah by the wrist. Thomas stood between them, arms raised, face red with rage and helplessness. Garrett fired once. The man holding Martha staggered back, howling a bullet clean through the meat of his arm. He dropped his gun. The second man turned, eyes wide. Garrett's second shot hit the lantern on the wall just behind him. Glass exploded. Fire burst against the logs. The room filled with smoke instantly. Chaos. Garrett barreled forward, grabbed Sarah, and shoved her behind him. Under the bed. He barked. Thomas yanked his sister toward the cot and dragged her beneath it. Martha snatched the dropped revolver and cocked it in one smooth motion. The wounded man scrambled for the door. She fired low, hit the floorboard by his foot. He froze. The kind of work that built muscles and sweat and something deeper memory. They raised the new frame with their bare hands. Garrett chopped the timber. Thomas stacked it and Martha planed it smooth. Sarah carried nails in her pockets like coins, handing them out one at a time with solemn pride. At night, they ate beside the barn. Garrett built a new table with his hands wide enough for all of them. Martha's stew got thicker with each passing day, flavored with wild onions and hard-earned peace. They took turns reading aloud from a Bible Garrett had once buried in a drawer. Martha's voice was strongest, though sometimes she'd hand the book to Thomas, who read slowly, stumbling through the longer verses. Garrett listened, eyes closed, lips, mouthing the words he hadn't spoken in years. One morning, a stranger approached. He was young, scared, ragged, his face, hollow boots torn open at the seams. He held a letter crumpled in his fist. Said he was looking for shelter. Said he'd heard of a place where people didn't turn you away just because you came broken. Garrett looked at Martha. She nodded. They gave him stew. Let him sleep in the hayloft. He stayed. Then another came, and another. By late spring, they'd raised 3 more cabins. Simple things, wooden frames and stone hearths, but strong. They called the place Lindley's Hollow, though it was Martha who insisted on the name. It was Garrett. She brought life here, he said. Let the name remember that. Word spread. Widows came with children, men with injuries, reputations, and empty hands, but willing hearts. No one was turned away unless they brought cruelty with them. And Garrett, who'd spent 2 decades listening to wolves and wind instead of men, became something else. Not a leader, not exactly, but a root, the kind of man people leaned on without even realizing it. He taught the boys to hunt, taught the girls to carve. He built tools, he repaired roofs. He walked the ridge every morning and prayed quietly without show. Not because he was righteous, but because he now understood what it meant to be grateful. Martha stood by him in everything. And every time Sarah called her mama and called Garrett Pa, the cabin walls seemed to grow a little stronger. One summer night, Garrett sat on the porch alone. The moon was high. Martha came out with 2 cups of tea, her belly round, with their child. She settled beside him, pressing her hand into his. "I never thought I'd have this," she whispered. Garrett turned his hand and held hers tight. "Neither did I." They didn't speak more. The silence between them was full of understanding, full of what had been lost and what had been found. Then Sarah's laugh drifted from inside. Thomas's voice followed, teasing her gently, and Garrett leaned back in his chair, the stars above so clear it hurt to look. He remembered what it was like to be alone. He remembered the cold, the aching quiet, the fear of being forgotten. And now, sitting beside a woman who chose him not once, but every day, after hearing the sounds of life behind him and feeling the future move beneath Martha's skin, Garrett Boone did something he hadn't done in 30 years. He wept not from sadness, but from the unbearable weight of joy. He didn't need a cabin to be whole. He didn't need a quiet life to be safe. He just needed them, and they were